Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear us? Give me a couple of head shakes up there. Thank you. Okay, so welcome to this discussion about food, music, and history. And I'm really delighted to be here. This is the inaugural Dallas Literary Festival. So I'm sure we're going to have an awesome conversation with Chef Alexander Smalls, and as well as culinary historian Adrian Miller. Before I introduce them, I just wanted to briefly introduce myself. I'm Karen Thomas. I'm a longtime journalist, and I've been a professor of practice at SMU. I don't consider myself a chef, but my baby brother is one, and he has coached me through the years. I can throw down a dish or two, but what I do well is eat. I love good food. So I'm like really excited about this conversation. I'm also really interested in how food in families actually intersects with history and legacies. So a lot of the work that these men have done is right up my alley. So let's start with our introductions. Adrian Miller is a James Beard award-winning author. He's a culinary historian, as I just said. His work spans the history of soul food, as well as the social and political impact of African Americans who's worked in the Presidential Food Service. He calls himself a recovering lawyer, and he's also worked in the Clinton White House and served as a senior policy analyst in the Colorado governor's office. I have to say, though, his coolest claim to fame, and he's going to have to talk a little bit about this, you know what I'm going to say, is that he's a certified Kansas City Barbecue Society judge. We have to hear more about what that is. I'd also like to introduce Chef Alexander Smalls. He's an artist. That's all I can say about that. Let's just start with the fact that he's got a Grammy, a Tony, and a James Beard Award. Like, how do you do that, okay? He's an opera singer, a chef, a restaurateur, and an author. His latest work, Meals, Music, and Muses, Recipes from My African American Kitchen, is a brilliant weave of music that spans from arias to jukeboxes and the food that such music inspires. For decades now, and I have to get to this part, Alexander's been elevating cuisine that has flowed from the African diaspora, making it the focus of fine dining and discussion. His parties in his Harlem home are the stuff of legends. And when I came across this passage, I have to share it with you, but I have to set the scene, okay? You've had a night at the theater. He invites you over afterwards. You want to get invited over afterwards. You have his Carolina bourbon barbecue shrimp and okra skewers. And as you're sitting there with the famous and myself, who's ordinary, he comes out with this tray of bourbon chocolate praline truffles, and someone slides into the piano bench and the music has moved from the background to front and center. That's a party, y'all, right there. That's a party. And he says, we sang one fun hit after another well into the night. Music and friends, chocolate and bourbon. I never have to leave the house to trip the lights. Fantastic. That is some great stuff. So I could spend the whole session sitting here being a fangirl to both their works. I know you didn't come here to hear me talk. So I want to just say that each of them have produced very beautiful books that are, you know, they're just studded with these recipes that will really tickle your palate, but they're also anecdotes and stories in each that will also feed your soul. So with that started, I want to go ahead and open up a conversation, and I very much want this to be a conversation. And I just want to start with this fact that both of you started in other professions, and at some point you pivoted into making culinary arts your life work. And I just wondered a little bit about how that happened, and then what role did food play in your life? Because really, second acts, we feed our passion, right? When we get to a second act, we're getting to something we really want to do. So I thought it would be a good place to start there. You're nodding your head, Adrian. You want to go ahead and kick this off?
Oh, sure. So yeah, it's good to be with you. Thank you so much. So I guess the first thing I should admit is that I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, which immediately loses me all street cred on the subject of soul food and barbecue. Well, let me win you back. My parents are from the South. My mom's from Chattanooga, Tennessee. My dad's from Helena, Arkansas. So I was a lawyer, and this is not to disparage anybody who's an attorney or you have attorneys in your family, but it wasn't for me. It got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office. So I figured I needed to do something else. So I was going to actually open up a soul food restaurant in Denver, but then I got a chance to work in the Clinton White House on something called the Initiative for One America. And so it was really at the end of that, working for him at the end of his second term. At that point in my life, I wanted to eventually go into politics and become the senator from Colorado. But the job market was really slow. I was watching a lot of daytime television. And in the depth of my depravity, I said, you know what? I should read something. So I went to the local bookstore and I got John Edgerton's book, Southern Food at Home, on the Road, in History. And I was browsing, I was in the cookbook section because I always like to cook. I've been cooking since an early age. And in that book, he wrote that the tribute to Black achievement in American cookery has yet to be written. And that's what launched the journey.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. Chef?
Hi, happy Sunday, everyone. Happy to be with you. You know, I get asked that question or one similar to it, you know, all the time. I have to say that there wasn't a time in my life when music and food were not front and center. Essentially growing up in a one-horse southern town, where the majority of the activity that we did centered around family. I was fortunate enough to have my grandfather sort of at one point of a pyramid, my uncle and aunt who moved back from Harlem to South Carolina when I was born to influence and expand the narrative of my education. My uncle was a chef and my aunt was a classical pianist. And essentially, my life took off through those two lenses where I learned to express myself. In the middle of all of that was my grandfather, who we called the city farmer, who plowed up a half an acre of his backyard every spring. And that old mule, Sadie, would come around the block, pulling that plow. And you have to remember, this is in the late 50s. And grandpa would get behind that plow. You know, he was already Superman to me, and command that mule and plow up that field. And he and I, that was our sacred ground. I was hanging on his every word and behind his every footstep. And I lived in that garden with my grandfather. And it began the education of life for me and understanding how things not only seeded and then blossomed and bloomed and grew into something I could eat. Now, my mother was trying to create that same dynamic in her rose gardens and flower beds. I had no interest. And I would be forced to because she said, you're in the garden with your grandfather, you can at least give my flowers some attention. I had no interest. There was something very special, deep, and revealing for me in that garden. And it made sense as I heard the stories of Edna Lewis growing up, and essentially when her first book came out, kind of reaffirming the importance of where our food comes from and the rituals of growing up in Freeport, Virginia, and learning essentially from her parents. And again, her parents were you know, former slaves, and my grandfather's parents were former slaves. So, you know, the cooking bug was there, the food bug was there. My aunt was a chef, my uncle was a chef, my father owned a nightclub and was in the grocery business. And at, you know, 8 years old, I decided I was going to be an opera singer or a concert pianist. So essentially I had very little room for anything else but those two disciplines. And it wasn't until, as you brought out earlier, I did have an interesting operatic career that took me around the world, met a whole lot of people, ate at a lot of fine dining restaurants, which was really the first glimpse of understanding that everybody's food was there but mine. And my food was no different. It just hadn't evolved and gone through the evolution of curated contemporary or modern or elevated concepts. And when I hit the glass ceiling in opera, which was after my third audition at the Metropolitan Opera, when I was, conveniently insulted, really, offered chorus in an opera that I'd already won several awards for, and backdoor bit parts. I left there that day and went home, drank the bottle of red wine that I'd smuggled in my suitcase from Paris, because I'd been studying at the Paris Opera House prior to the audition. And the next morning, I understood what I was going to do. 18 months later, I was building my first restaurant, Cafe Beulah. So that kind of is how I went from the little boy playing the piano in South Carolina to greeting folks every night on Park Avenue South in New York City.
That's a terrific tale. I do want to tell the audience you're able to ask questions in the chat room if you'd like, and we will get to them. I just meant to tell you that in the beginning. So I think a really great place to start talking about food is perhaps with the idea of what is soul food. It certainly has been maligned in a lot of different ways. It's certainly, I think each of you have had takes on it. I mean, you call yourself the soul food scholar, Mr. Miller, and I know the chef also has talked about sort of it being stigmatized and the boundaries around that particular term. So I thought it would be, just good to hear how each of you define that and what that actually means.
Yeah, Chef Smalls, why don't you go ahead first?
I thought you were going to lay the foundation for us. Well, let me say this, because I relate to soul food in somewhat of a different way, and that being my job as a culinary activist was to take who we were beyond the chains that bound, the stereotypes, and the idea and attitude that anytime a Black person walked in the kitchen, they were making soul food. Soul food for me was kind of like soul brother, soul music, soul sister, essentially in an era and in our own progression through society and through from slavery to civil rights, etc. We have had to work harder than anybody to determine, pride and dignity, a platform, and essentially own something. And what you have to understand about food and music and art is that was what we really owned. There were times in our history we didn't own ourselves, but we owned what we cooked. We owned what we sang. We owned our song. And essentially that was our pride, and that was our identifier, and that was our recognition. And, at one point, the powers that be and corporate white America stepped in essentially and started to package what we own and sell it back to us in the forms of Bojangles chicken and Kentucky Fried and all kinds of things. And it was ours as a symbol, but essentially they had created the wealth around it and taken it with them. We were now paying for the right, really, to have the association. But my point is bigger than that. I was on a mission. As I said before, when I traveled the capitals of Europe and the world, tasting everything from Mama's Kitchen to the most elevated gourmet cooking, our food that came from the foundation of quote unquote soul food was good enough to be in those places. And when I looked at the landscape approaching what I wanted to do in that space, I knew that I had to do something that essentially brought us into that level of the conversation. I was when my first restaurant opened, there's a very famous food critic who was doing a story. She never told me the name of the story. It ultimately came out as Soul Food Now. And she kept asking me questions, and I kept saying to her, well, I don't do soul food. I'm doing, food that is inspired by Southern culture and heritage and African-American people. And I was avoiding the categories that she most desperately needed to put me in. And so she said at one point, well, you have fried chicken on your menu. And I said, well, actually, it's fried poisson, my dear. And she said, you have collard greens and cornbread. Well, that's soul food, where the way I understand it. And I said, well, and if I were an 80-year-old woman, would it still be soul food? There was a pregnant pause, and there was a mutual understanding. And there was also a friendship born out of that. I don't know that, I'm going to leave it to Adrian to tell you what soul food is, but essentially, what I tried to do in that space is to essentially make room for the image of Black people who cooked anything, variety. We weren't tied to that stigma, or that's all we did. As a chef, meeting people, as soon as I'm told, they're told that I'm a chef, they say to me, oh, I love soul food. So do I. We have something in common. Anyway, I'm gonna let you take it, Adrian.
Right.
I don't know if I'm doing such a good job.
No, that's hilarious. So yeah, just to build on what Alexander said, I say that soul food is the melding of the culinary ingredients and traditions of three places: West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas. And that all comes together in the American South. And unfortunately, soul food has become shorthand for all African-American cooking. And as Alexander points out, that's not really the case. I think Low Country cooking, Creole, and Southern, I think, are related to soul food, but different. And the twist that I argued in my soul food book is that I argue that soul food really is the food that Black migrants took out of the South and transplanted in other parts of the country, because it's a condensation of the food available in the South. Because there's, like for instance, greens. I mean, the number of greens that people ate in the South is numerous, but when you think soul food, you're thinking collards, kale, mustard, turnip, cabbage, those kind of things, dried black eyed peas. So really, it's a condensation, and then it's the celebration of the food, because the migrant story is often this: you get to a new place, you try to recreate home, and if you can do it with the exact same stuff you had from the old country, quote unquote, you do that. But typically you don't. So you have to find substitutes. For instance, peach cobbler, right? It's the difference between making peach cobbler with fresh peaches or frozen or canned peaches in a different place. And then, you've got new neighbors. And so you're looking at the stuff that they are eating. And usually when you arrive in a place, you're poor. And so you're struggling. So you're eating kind of subsistence food. But then once you prosper, you're settled and you prosper, you start bringing in the good times food, right? The celebration food. And instead of eating it every once in a while, you eat it more regularly. So, people may not know this, but fried chicken was at one point in our history was something you ate maybe every once in a while.
Yes.
It was not something you would have multiple times a week or even multiple times a day. And so I argue that soul food is really the celebration of the food of South. It's really the migrant story that's reflected through our food. And in terms of the actual coining of the term, it's what Alexander said. It really comes out of the music world, because this term soul was floating around in Black culture well before the 1960s, but it was talking about soul music. And then later it catches on to soul brothers, soul sisters, soul food. And the last thing I'll say is people often ask me, well, what's the difference between soul food and Southern food? And I say that soul food tastes better.
I like that.
Or seasoning, at least. I was going to ask, so some of what you're talking about, particularly when you were talking about your grandfather and the garden and the plow and all of that, we're talking farm to table, right? I mean,
Yes, we are.
That is exactly what that is.
We
and
are.
so some of this conversation really is centered around cultural appropriation when it comes to food. And you guys seem to be doing work, in my estimation, that's sort of uncovering and highlighting that history and its roots in terms of where some of these culinary traditions come from, because we may not know that. And what made me really think about that is Mr. Miller's new book that's about to come out, Black Smoke, where you had an incredible detail in there where you said, out of 33 winners in, I think it was a barbecue contest, and I don't remember.
A Barbecue Hall of Fame, the American Royal Barbecue. Yeah.
Only 3 were Black. And so I was like, wow, how did that happen? I mean, I can imagine how. I really would like to talk a bit about things like that and what that means and how.
Yeah, so in the barbecue story, it's really interesting because in my book is not the traditional kind of media critique, because I lay a lot of this blame on the media, the representations of barbecue that emerge, because typically it's been, hey, y'all have never really historically ever given African American credit. But in the case of barbecue, I'm just saying, can we get back to what you did before the 1990s? Because before the 1990s, African Americans were considered the standard bearers for barbecue, and in fact, excellent barbecue. And that changes with the emergence of competition culture, kind of food media. And so, we get to the point now where pretty much it's only white dudes who are celebrated in barbecue. And that's usually the Bubba type, Dukes of Hazzard, Moonshiners, Duck Dynasty, they're all kind of the same dude. Even though African Americans live in rural areas, they never get a show. I don't know why. Well, actually, I do know why. And then you've got the hipster, right, with the interesting glasses and facial hair and tattoos. You've got the competition person and the fine dining chef, because now fine dining chefs are in barbecues in ways they were never before, like 30 years ago. And so the seminal moment when I knew I had to write this book is I was watching the Food Network, and Paula Deen had a special. It was called Paula Deen's Southern Barbecue. And, this was before a lot of the other stuff came out. I know, Alexander, you're beating me to the punchline. So, the show going on for an hour. I just said, let me watch it because I want to learn more about Southern barbecue being in Denver. When the credits were rolling, not one African-American had been interviewed on air. And so at first I thought, well, maybe I got it twisted. Maybe it was Paula Deen's Scandinavian barbecue. Then I knew that wasn't.
Oh, God.
And then so I just started looking around, and it wasn't just that show. It was like most of the shows on the Food Network, media, magazines, all over the place. African Americans have been pushed to the sidelines. So my book is this new book, Black Smoke, is part celebration. It's a celebration of African American barbecue culture, and then it's part restoration. It's bringing African Americans back to the center of the barbecue narrative. And I'm not saying white people cannot cook barbecue. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there's a lot of room for everyone at the cookout. And so let's just get back to that.
Well, can I chime in and do the other side of that part of that conversation is it's the same thing with farm to table, as you touched upon. I mean, essentially, Alice Waters started farm to table as far as corporate America is concerned. And not Edna Lewis. I mean, only in hindsight and only when it's convenient and only when it's Black History Month. But the truth of the matter is that these practices were all started in the slave fields. And essentially, that's why African slaves were here to begin with, is for their skills in agriculture and farming. And so every time you hear farm to table, it is associated with white chefs. And it's as if Black chefs are visiting in that space or artificially put there. It's really quite extraordinary. But again, that's food apartheid. That's what happens when essentially you take a talent, an art, a discipline, and reassign it in our society, and essentially cut the people that created the platform, out of it. And that's what we see.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry about that.
Oh.
Oh, so that was one of the more striking kind of conclusions from my work on soul food is that when we study slavery in high school and stuff, you don't get an accurate or in-depth picture. So to understand the fact that enslaved Africans were brought here for their agricultural knowledge, how they built certain very profitable industries here in this country, but then I didn't realize the extent to which enslaved people gardened, how slaveholders would often control food as a symbol of power, and how my enslaved ancestors had to figure out how to subsist by gardening, foraging, hunting, fishing, doing all of these things. And then the fact that in some cases enslaved people purchased their freedom because they had that green thumb. So in some situations, enslaved people were allowed to go to the nearby city and sell excess produce and chickens that they had raised and other things, and they purchased their freedom. So I just thought that was just a remarkable story.
Mm-hmm.
Well, also circling back to what you were talking about earlier about seeing Paula Deen doing her barbecue. I mean, Paula Deen essentially kidnapped soul food and essentially made herself the face of a gentle soul food, if you will. But still, everybody in the kitchen was Black in a pink apron and uniform. I mean, and this was entertainment.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny when I give my talks, there's a point when I'm talking about the difference between Southern and soul and how that divorce kind of happens in the 60s. And so I just ask people, hey, name somebody on TV associated with soul food. Maybe you would not surprised. I mean, Paula Deen comes up all the time. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting.
Wow. That's a good segue into your book about presidential service, because thinking about that too, you also have to think about the political impact that food may be able to bring if you're able to have that sort of access. So would you talk just a little bit about what you found in your book when you were working on that concept?
Sure. And I was just really happy to write this collective biography because there have been some mentions of African Americans who have cooked for our presidents, but never all brought together in one book. And the reason I did this is because I was researching my soul food book and I found these stories and I just wanted to dig a little deeper. And so I would argue that some presidents who are really savvy have realized that they can use food to augment their personal appeal, as well as show they have the common touch, which ultimately translate to political results, right? When you're a popular president, you can get stuff done. And it was just very interesting how these African Americans were enlisted to help. Now, a lot of African Americans came into White House cooking because they were the enslaved cook of a slaveholding president, or they were the private cook of somebody who would eventually become president. So the path to the White House kitchen for much of our history has been accidental. And if you were to step back and just look at the broad sweep of people who have worked in the White House, at least in the culinary space, the most typical person would be an African American woman. That's been the typical worker over the span of time. Now that has not been the story recently, because ever since Jacqueline Kennedy came in the White House and kind of wanted to elevate White House food to have a European kind of classical French feel, that's when we start to see the waning of African Americans in that space. But yes, they nurtured and nourished our first families. And a lot of times, when the president, it's a stressful job and they wanted to get junk food, even though the first lady and the White House doctor were saying, don't give them that, the president's going to get hooked up. One of my favorite stories real quickly is the story of Zephyr Wright, who was the longtime cook for Lyndon Johnson. And as he was lobbying for passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he actually used her Jim Crow experiences in the South to mobilize support for that bill. And when he signed it, he gave her one of the pens and said, "You deserve this as much as anyone." So we see this example of a White House cook actually, kind of shaping history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have a question in the chat here. Annie Benjamin wants to know, how do you approach writing down recipes and cooking that's been passed down via oral tradition? So there might not be a written record, I suppose.
Well, see, I'm a non-cooking brother, unlike Chef Small. So what I would have to do is find a chef to translate this stuff for me. So, a lot of times I'm looking for a recipe tester or somebody. So I feel like my job is to put the recipe in context and maybe talk about why is this recipe resonant and how we get to that space. But to the actual cooking, I would hand that off to somebody to help me with that. And sometimes it's tricky, right? Because you have to update ingredients, or the technology is different that we use now. So that was my approach.
I think also it depends on whether or not it's about authenticity or it's about recreating, the impression, the experience. What we have to understand about a recipe is that it's a roadmap. It's a way to get you from one place to the next. It's a way to help you translate an experience, an edible experience. I often say to people, I never cook the same thing twice, and it confuses them. But the truth of the matter is that I don't. I create recipes all day long, but once you understand the basic principles of what that recipe produces, then you own it. and in part of owning it, it becomes yours. So the recipe may call for lime, and you decide to go off to lemon, or you decide to go off to orange juice. So, I mean, I think that unless you are looking for an heirloom concept, I would first go to Adrian and say, look, I need history on this. Can you figure out the history? Then you put it in context, and then you go about creating that recipe based on the context and the flavor profile of that period. And with your knowledge of cooking, you create the math, the chemistry that brings all those pieces together in perfect form.
Yeah. I want to amend something I said earlier. I described myself as a non-cooking brother. That's not accurate. I got skills. I mean, I can cook, but I'm not saying I'm professionally trained. That's what I meant.
No, I understand, because I have this whole argument with my own brother who's like, throw out the recipe. Why are you using the recipe? I'm like, I'm not you. I need
I need this.
Right.
But I always do a dry run, because one of the biggest fears of rejection I have is somebody tasting my food and looking disappointed. That would be soul crushing. So I usually do a dry run.
Let's talk a little bit about music and food, because I mean, I really can't imagine cooking without listening to music at the same time. So your book really spoke to my soul, because I mean, it's what you do in the kitchen, right? You have to listen to.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and if you're not listening to music, you better be singing. You better be moving your hips. You better be keeping a beat. I mean, that's the point. These people who talk about, I don't like to cook. You haven't created a relationship with what cooking is all about, because therein lies the problem. You have to, first of all, cooking is love, to borrow a term from my dear departed old friend who used to call me Sweet Potato, Sylvia Woods. She used to say, every time you asked her what was soul food, she'd say, cooking with love, cooking with love. Soul is love, and so that takes you where you need to go. It's an emotional moment. So if you don't have a beat, you're not doing anything. Okay, you just might as well open up frozen food carton and throw it in the table toaster. So you got to get into the spirit. I mean, imagine putting on, Aretha Franklin's "I Say a Little Prayer for You," opening up that refrigerator, pulling out those cabinets, and going, "Oh gosh, this morning I woke up before, I'm gonna make something, and I'm gonna say a little prayer for you too." And so the music really helps transform us into the perfect setting to create something creative. You have to give yourself that. For me, music is a language. It's a language that I'd rather speak sometimes than actually talking or talking to somebody else. So I can sing to myself all day. They sang in the cotton fields. They sang in the tobacco fields. I mean, this is what occupied and fed the soul and the spirit. So that's what food is. Food is feeding your body, is nurturing you. So they are perfect fit.
And just two quick things on music and food in my work. For just childhood memories of my mother singing gospel songs, because she was in the choir, so usually she was practicing the songs that she was going to sing. But my mother and father sang gospel while they were cooking. Sometimes my father would, grew up in rural Arkansas, so sometimes near Helena. So sometimes I'd get a little blues in there too, but usually it was gospel. And one thing I was searching for that I didn't find is when I looked at the early descriptions of barbecue, digging a trench, chopping the wood, flipping that animal carcass, which enslaved Africans and later enslaved African Americans were the primary workers for that. I was hoping to find a work song similar to what was done in the cotton fields and other things to coordinate the work, but I just haven't found that. So that's one thing I'm still looking for, because I have no doubt that their music was involved while they were doing this cooking, because usually they were cooking for hours at a time. So I'm on the search for that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Chef, I understand that you might have an album that will go side by side with your book. How's that coming?
Look at you. Where did you get that information?
I did my research.
I'm nervous.
do tell.
Well, okay, so last year and the end of the year before, so 2019, a little bit of 2020, I went into the studio and began a new project. Now, this is the first time in the studio in over 30 years. But it was essentially a project about what I consider endangered music, endangered African-American music, starting with the spiritual. Essentially, most people really don't understand the fullness and the power and what spirituals were all about. It was essentially developed around the fact that people needed to have their personal lives in a tribal setting. African slaves were not allowed to sing their traditional songs and dance and have the drums in the way in which they did. They were only really allowed to do things that were around religious music, religious discipline. So they took Bible verses and they took hymns and they assigned them to African melodies and melodies they would make up, and they would create music that later became known as spirituals. These spirituals were used for a number of uses: everyday life, sharing information, but also Underground Railroad and getting out news and something they could share that belonged to them. And that takes us back to the whole concept of a song. So I went in, when slavery was over, the church inherited all of that music because where else was it going to go? And so I decided that I wanted to take some Negro spirituals and recontextualize them and put them into another setting. The musical setting I chose was jazz. And so I got 2 Grammy Award-winning producers, some Grammy Award-winning jazz musicians, and I went to the studio and we recorded these songs. And I even did a little spoken word. And I plan to release the album the end of the summer this year, 2021. So nice. We will see.
I'm curious because one thing I'm thinking about future projects for me, I'm really interested in maybe doing something on street vendors and street cries. Have you ever thought about putting something out about them?
Well, you know, and what a great place to kind of look at that from Porgy and Bess. You know, the Honey Man, the Strawberry Lady. It's fascinating, and I would say that that could be a very interesting project, putting together even some known singers and putting them in that genre. You know, like if you took some singers from the various disciplines and then recreate a recording of a number of those noted songs from street vendors. I like that. Yeah. Do it.
So nobody listening, don't steal my idea. I was being communal by sharing that.
I think Kelly Yardell is going to steal it.
But let me tell you this, I am thinking about approaching Beyonce, and I'll let her sing about Lemonade if she wants that to be her street cry.
I love it. But, you know, also you could really use new creative tunes, you know, and just do them in that idiom. Because what the real point is what it is. And again, these things get lost culturally. So it's nice. So I'll give you a sneak previews to the 40 or so people on here. Here's the recording. Let us break bread together.
I love it.
I love that. Love the photo too.
Oh, well, you know, a couple of bourbons.
Seems to be a theme in your food.
Bourbon, yeah. Imagine that.
Imagine that. I wanted to take some time to talk about, well, we're okay time-wise, about the pandemic and sort of its impact as we're approaching this, particularly on Black chefs and restaurants. I mean, the restaurant industry has been hit so hard. I wondered how you all are surviving as you were isolated and your book tour was just getting underway and was sidelined, and there's just so much going on, and there was so much on top with social justice and what happened with George Floyd. And it has just been a really, really difficult time. And certainly we know throughout history that with protests and the civil rights movement, and even before that, that food has played such an instrumental role in times like this, that I just was wondering how you saw that happening, because we're also isolated at the same time, and what that has meant for you on a personal level in navigating that. Like, how are you soothing your souls? What are you eating at home? What's your comfort food? Let's start there.
Well, I'm doing a lot more takeout than I normally do because I'm just trying to support these restaurants. And so, it's been interesting. And from my perch, the African American restaurants that were primarily geared towards takeout have fared all right under these circumstances. Really, the places that had more of a sit-down dining operation that have struggled and closed. And some of my favorite places here in Denver have closed. Now, of course, I did not want those tragedies to happen with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many other. We got to remember, there are still people getting killed. But I've been busier than ever because in the wake of those tragedies, there's been a rush to affirm African Americans and culture and be supportive. So a lot of people have reached out to me. And one thing I'm thinking about is how can I use my talents with food and writing and my knack for bringing people together to possibly create a way for us to create spaces where we can talk about this stuff so we can work through it. And so I've been thinking about that a lot. So I'm just trying to nourish my soul as well as my physical being in this time. But it's been difficult, and the pandemic certainly affected my work because I had to cut my research short because I just couldn't travel. So I had to rely a lot on just what I saw on the internet and newspapers and other things to tell the story.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I would say that my experience is very similar to Adrian's. I mean, interestingly enough, the pandemic hit, well, officially in March, but we now know that it was here in really November, December of 2019. But my book had just come out in February. Seems like my last two books have all come out in February, sort of around my birthday. And all set to travel and do all kinds of things, and boom, I haven't been on a plane in a year and a half, so 18 months. And for someone who traveled every other month, and if I didn't have anywhere to go, I would create somewhere to go. It was an addiction. I've been at home. You can see what I've been doing from my Instagram page. I have 3 refrigerators, a restaurant stove, and 3 wine coolers. So I've been putting a lot of cheese in the window. I've had 5 restaurants. Fortunately, I had closed my last restaurant before the pandemic. And so it was a sigh of relief for me personally, because just the employees, I mean, that just would have killed me. I had 2 restaurants open. And the idea, and I had over 100 full and full-time employees. And I mean, I would have, I would have just killed myself just worrying about them and figuring out how I can help. And, because it's like a family. So, I applaud so many of the restaurants. I can speak about the ones here in Harlem, from Sylvia's to Melba's to my former chef, J.J. Johnson, and his restaurants. They got involved in feeding people, feeding children, feeding communities, feeding the city. And I think that probably was a tremendous blessing for a number of African-American restaurants who faced these hardship times. They were able to keep staff on. They were able to find ways through nonprofits and assistance to keep the staff intact and be useful in a very, very difficult time. But to Adrian's point, a number of restaurants have closed and won't be opening again. A number of fledgling businesses that, independent small businesses who were, chasing their American dream a huge dead end for them. And, I can only hope that, when we are in a better place, that they will have the wherewithal to remount their charge to be. But it's been very difficult, and it's been a heavy burden of worry and stress, I think, on all of us, because we're all feeling the pain of this displacement.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna take a question from the chat here. We have like 5 minutes left. Kelly Yandel asks, Tony Tipton Martin has done an amazing job on shining light on African-American women who didn't get credit or attention for the contributions to early publishing in cuisine. Has either of you have particular muses or influences that we may not know of?
So for me, it was for the soul food book, it was definitely Edna Lewis. I read a lot of her work, and that informed my writing there. The other two books, there wasn't a muse because there wasn't anyone who had written about them in such a way. So I was kind of flying solo on that.
Okay. Jeff?
Well, I have to resonate the same, Adrian. Edna Lewis, who was a friend, and I consider myself a mentee of hers. And actually, I just wrote an article about her for Bon Appetit magazine that's out, April issue. Huge influence. The community at large is my influence. I mean, when I started this industry and out in this industry, there were very few of us. There was me, there was Jezebel's, Alberta Wright, who had a restaurant in New York and opened one in Paris for 15 minutes. They didn't get it. It was too fancy. It was a Black restaurant that was too fancy in Paris, because Leroy Haynes, who was also one of my great inspirations, had opened a soul food restaurant in Pigalle in Paris. As a young opera singer, I used to go there. That they loved. The French loved it, but it was a soul food restaurant. Now, you're not going to tell the French folks that you're now fancy. And your soul food is now fine dining, and that was the problem with Jezebel's in Paris. But I digress. But so people like that, people like again B. Smith. I mean, but essentially there weren't but a handful of us. The great Patrick Clark, the chef. Who was one of the first pioneers in fine dining and study. In fact, studying at the Paris Opera House, I ran into him one night. I was meeting a friend at a bar, and I was on time and they weren't. And sitting next to me was Patrick Clark, who was doing a stage with a French chef, and got to know him. And then he came back and opened Odeon, which was the first sort of continental upscale restaurant in Tribeca, New York. So, I mean, again, it was a small fraternity of people that were in the space. So I'm encouraged, I'm excited, I'm motivated by all of these young chefs who are doing everything they're supposed to be doing, as far as I'm concerned. And the legacy that I would like to leave back is having, been there, hopefully as an example, and someone who cheerleaded them on.
That's a wonderful place to stop this discussion. You guys have been terrific. I am so grateful that I got to moderate this. It's been so much fun. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I hope that you will, there's a couple of more sessions to come with the festival. I think some of that's in the chat for you to look at. Again, let us thank the chef and Mr. Miller for their time, and appreciate you both. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Good to
Thank
be with
you
you.
very much for joining us. I could listen to you guys all day.
Thank you.